Hey everyone, welcome or welcome back to Engelbard. First-party games were often the killer apps for game systems back in the 8 and 16-bit eras. If you were a Nintendo fan, chances are you loved Mario, Zelda, Metroid, or all of the above. Likewise, if you were a Sega fan, there's pretty good odds that you really enjoyed Wonder Boy, Sonic, Streets of Rage, or even Phantasy Star. The lack of major first-party titles was often responsible for the murder, or at least early death, of quite a few game systems. There were a few third-party publishers who could often produce games of the same level of quality as the big first-party titles. One of those publishers was, and still is, Capcom. If you look at Capcom's libraries on systems like the NES, SNES, Genesis, Saturn, PlayStation, and beyond, you'll find an awful lot of really high-quality titles. But you know what hardware Capcom never produced a single game for? That's right, the Sega Master System. You know what hardware ended up with Capcom games on it anyway? The Sega Master System. How did this crime against nature happen? Well, you see, Capcom licensed out a few of its games to other developers and publishers. So in total, there were 6 Capcom games that ended up on the Sega Master System, and they ranged in quality from to ugh. Most of these games were pretty much region-locked into a few specific territories, but a couple of them did manage to sneak their way into most of the major regions. Want to see how all these games turned out? Well, here they are anyway! Sega famously brought Ghouls and Ghosts, the second game in the series, to the Genesis in 1989, roughly around the time of the launch of the system. They programmed that version themselves, Capcom didn't work on it at all. It famously won EGM's Game of the Year award in 1989 as well. In 1990, Sega would release another version of Ghouls and Ghosts, this time for the Sega Master System. They also developed it in-house. The Sega Master System version of Ghouls and Ghosts changes things up with new armor, magic, and weapon systems that function differently than the arcade original and its more accurate ports. It helps make this version stand out a little more, and this is the best version of the game that runs on completely 8-bit hardware. On the downside, this game is a little sloppy with some iffy collision detection and glitches. Want to get extra chests really easily? Just sprout one up, walk off the screen, and then walk back and watch a second one form over top of the original. Want to skip through parts of the levels? You can do that too. Despite these shortcomings, its somewhat unique twists make it worth playing. And yes, you do have to go through the game twice at minimum before you can finish it. Sega Master System Ghouls and Ghosts looks okay, has all the levels and bosses from the arcade game, and retains the play mechanics of the arcade and Genesis ports pretty well. This is the best of the Capcom games that ended up on the Sega Master System. Ghouls and Ghosts for the Sega Master System is absolutely worth playing, and I give it the coveted review score of Another awesome Capcom game that Sega brought to the Genesis themselves was Strider. You know what? It also won EGM's Game of the Year award, this time in 1990. And man, Sega outdid themselves with this masterpiece. Strider would also arrive on the Sega Master System in 1991. This time, while Sega published it, they didn't develop it, they only kind of oversaw it. This was developed by Tiertex, an infamously terrible European outfit that screwed up a bunch of arcade ports on home computers, primarily in the early 90s. Strider on the SMS is, well, see for yourself. The game is slow, like really slow. When you look at the speed of the arcade or Genesis versions, you have to wonder why they thought this was acceptable. Sure, the little 8-bit Master System couldn't have done anywhere near a perfect port of the arcade game, but we've seen plenty of SMS games with large sprites that move a lot faster than this. Also, they really f***ed up running down the mountain in Stage 2, which is totally the single best moment in good versions of the game. This piece of digital junk was based on the Tiertex port of Strider to 8 and 16-bit home computers. The SMS version, to its credit, is slightly less awful than those ports, most likely since Sega did, at minimum, oversee it. Those versions don't even have some of the levels in the right order. But to put things into perspective, if playing Tiertex's computer ports of Strider is like getting kicked in the nuts by a steel-toed boot, then SMS Strider is like getting kicked in the nuts by a loafer. The game looks bad, plays badly, sounds bad, basically it has no redeeming qualities, and the only reason to play this would be to use it as an alternative to self-flagellation if you just can't find a good Cat o' Nine Tails anywhere. I give Strider for the SMS the dreaded review score of... ugh. Here's our first non-EGM Game of the Year title, Forgotten Worlds. As with both Ghouls and Ghosts and Strider, Sega ported Forgotten Worlds to the Genesis themselves. And while it didn't exactly get rave reviews, it was an excellent port of the arcade game considering the tiny 4 megabit cartridge it was on and how early this game was. I liked it a lot back in the day, despite the cuts in background detail and missing a few levels from the arcade original. While the prior 2 titles I covered made their way to the US, the rest of the games I'm covering here did not, including this one. Forgotten Worlds for the SMS was programmed by Sega and released only in Europe and Brazil, initially coming out in 1991. Because of that, this title seems to be generally less well known than some of the others. As you can see, it's a pretty competent version of Capcom's rotation-based shooter, or shoot 'em up, or shmup. I don't care what you call the genre. It's really cut back in several ways. It's only 1 player and it only has 5 levels, with one of them being completely new and unique to this version of the game. There are also 3 instances in this version of Forgotten Worlds, where one of its levels combines sections of 2 levels from the original game. Still, this is a surprisingly good version of what was originally a visually complex 16-bit shooter. It looks good, the music is okay, it plays well, and I was really kind of shocked by it. Forgotten Worlds isn't just a great port of a pretty good game, I'd say it's one of the best horizontal shooters on the system, right up there with Sega and R-Type. Yeah, Forgotten Worlds earns the excellent review score of Another Capcom game that Sega ported to the Genesis themselves was MERCS, the sequel to Commando. MERCS is one of my absolute favorite overhead run-and-gun games. The Genesis port was a little more scaled down than the prior Sega ports in some ways, but still excellent. It also included a whole second original game on the cartridge, and that was also great, with completely new levels, gameplay, elements, and music. MERCS hit the Sega Master System in Europe and Brazil. It initially came out in 1991. Sadly, I have to report that this version was brought to life by Tiertex. And we're not quite done with them after this. I'm sorry. The SMS version of MERCS just isn't good. It gets rid of all of the music except a little jingle right before boss fights. There's also rarely more than 2 enemy soldiers on screen. The control and character movement is hinky. That's right, I said hinky. And the collision detection is questionable. You're also up against an incredibly aggressive timer that there was just no reason for. Yeah, no matter how you slice it, this is a giant disappointment. I can't really recommend that anyone check out Sega Master System MERCS unless they find that their life is too exciting and they really need to do something to dull things down a little. MERCS for the Master System earns a review score of... ugh. So after the success of Strider, Capcom apparently lost their damn mind and allowed US Gold, and by proxy, Tiertex, to release an original sequel to Strider. This has nothing to do with Capcom's own arcade Strider 2, which didn't come out until years after this mess. Strider 2, aka Strider Returns, made its way to many different platforms, and sadly, one of them is the Sega Master System. Now you could make the argument that this version of Strider 2 isn't really a Capcom game, since Capcom didn't produce an original and have other companies port it. I don't care, I'm including it anyway, since it is, at minimum, a Capcom property. US Gold and Tiertex took a look at everything that made the original Strider amazing. The acrobatics, the inclines, the speed, the incredible set pieces, and then decided, no, f*** all that shit, we can do Strider better than Capcom. Yeah, then they turned this into an incredibly generic Euro platformer starring Strider, who can barely even swing his sword in this version. Strider Returns, or Strider 2 II, is a much more basic experience than the original. There are hardly any inclines, no real satellites, oh, and Strider will mostly attack by throwing slow little shuriken now. Strider Returns is a bad game on every platform. The people responsible for this disaster should be incarcerated. For my retro gaming friends, they have committed a crime against video games. Strider Returns looks terrible, plays worse, and sounds even worse than that. Strider Returns should be outlawed under the Geneva Convention as a form of torture. Strider 2/Strider Returns earns the review score of ugh. You know what game was totally awesome and single-handedly reinvigorated the slowly decaying arcade industry at the time of its release? Street Fighter 2. Did you know that Street Fighter 2 had an official release in Brazil for the Sega Master System? It was developed and published by Tectoy and came out in 1997. That's right, an official Sega Master System game in 1997. It's kinda based on Street Fighter 2 Turbo. So how do Ryu and the gang fare in the good old Sega Master System? As you can see here, the answer to that is...
not well.
Street Fighter 2 on the Sega Master System is really nothing more than a novelty. This game exists solely to allow people on YouTube to say to the rest of the world, "Did you know that Street Fighter 2 had an official release in Brazil for the Sega Master System?" The graphics are kind of acceptable even though they're severely cut back. The backgrounds are pretty sparse, and several are kind of devoid of detail. There's a fair amount of animation frames for the characters, and their size is kind of impressive, but those are pretty much the only positives here. Pulling off special moves is basically impossible. If you can perform a fireball in this game, I worship your gaming skills. I can occasionally and somewhat miraculously pull off a hurricane kick with Ryu, but that's about it. Playing as Chun-Li is the best option if you want to get to the generic ending, since you can just mash the kick button over and over for her special. Hey, at least one special move works right in the game! The music stinks, the control stinks, the collision detection stinks. Street Fighter 2 for the Sega Master System stinks. It's worth looking at if you're curious, I guess, and just want to experience it, but as a game, this earns the review score of... ugh. So that's it. That's every Capcom game that found its way onto the Sega Master System. Now, in general, we got two good ones in Ghouls and Ghosts and Forgotten Worlds that are still worth playing today. The other four are not even really worth looking at anymore. And I can't help but wonder how much better MERCS and Strider in particular would have been had Sega developed those games internally rather than farming them out to that company whose name is so vile that I won't dirty this video by mentioning it again. Alright, just this one time. Tiertex. That'll just about do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please toss it a like. If you haven't already, please subscribe and help spread the word about the channel. If you want to share your opinions on these Capcom games or on the video in general, please go ahead and leave a comment. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.